So in this argumentation lecture, we're just going to do the basics of what argumentation is, what's the component of an argument, evaluations of evidence, and we're going to look at some fallacies of arguments and just better ways to attack an argument. And once you get the basics down, it's very easy. Even if you don't have an intimate understanding of what your opponent's saying, there's a bunch of logical fallacies that you can get into to give you a better grounding in a debate and get you back into a debate in which you don't have an expertise. So it wouldn't be an Argumentation 101 lecture without a definition. Oxford says an argumentation is a reason or set of reasons given with the aim of persuading others that an action or idea is right or wrong. I think that's the most succinct way of saying it. I mean, it just comes down to what? I have an idea. I believe I'm right. I'm going to convince you why I'm right. I believe that my argument is better than your argument. That's what it basically comes down to. Does anybody have some other ideas of what they think an argument should also have? Or is it just an argument is taking one idea and convincing your opponents, your mom, your dad, that you are correct? Yeah. It's from Oxford for a reason. Does everybody have this down?
Not yet.
We'll work on flowing later. So, anyone, what do you think is the component of a solid, sound argument? Yep.
Facts.
Okay, you need some facts for arguments. A thesis. You do need to have some direction in which you're making your arguments. Monica? Warrants. Okay. That is one key component. Harm. So, in a sense, sorry.
Like, why is it bad?
Why is it bad,
Why is
or
it bad? Good.
why you should refer that argument? Well, all of them come down to three key components of an argument. You need a claim. So, for instance, I'm sure all of you have taken a look at the immigration disadvantage. For those of you in public forum and Lincoln Douglas, if they haven't looked at it, it's just saying that immigration reform that's currently in Congress is going to pass now. Some circumstances might prevent that from passing, and then there are many benefits to immigration, such as what an influx of immigrants would do for our economy, how they would improve our workforce, and such. So the claim that comes from it, let's start with the uniqueness argument. The claim is immigration reform will pass now. Okay? That's saying something is going to happen. But it doesn't have the second level to that is a warrant, right? This is the how or the why, right? Whenever you look at something, you're always like, okay, that's nice, but what's the reasoning behind that? As Monica was getting to, you need to have a solid argument. Your argument has to have a warrant to that. So going back to the cross-ex between Todd and I, what is a warrant for why immigration might pass right now? The GOP needs to appeal to Latino voters. That is a warrant of why immigration is going to pass right now. Another warrant might be that the Senate has the required 60 votes to do it, and there's a cite of Senator Reid saying that. Is providing evidence, evidence or data that supports your claim. So this can come in terms of when you in public forum or Lincoln Douglas, where you have a statistic that supports your claim of just what a demographic or something along those lines that just provides a little bit of a general background to it. Because whenever you're in a debate, how many times does somebody make a claim and you're like, okay, why? That doesn't make any sense. You've had that a couple of times, and maybe like a cross-ex, and they'll be like, how do you get to your impact? And they're just like, well, nuclear war leads to extinction. And it's just like, I mean, you've seen apocalypse movies, right? You've seen some of that stuff. It's not like it just bomb drops or something and there's extinction. There's a lot of intertwining factors that lead to that, and that's how your claims get in. Does that make sense? So, in terms of the affirmative case, has everybody been able to see the affirmative case, the Cuba app that's been put out? Okay. So let's just continue with immigration. What would another example of a warrant be to the claim that immigration is good for the economy?
It increases relations so that we can have materials from Mexico.
So how would it increase relations?
Like soft power would increase friendliness or the ability to cooperate so that if we needed an ally from Mexico, we could get that.
And so that was two claims of it boosts the economy, immigration boosts the economy, it boosts the economy because it increases relations. And a way of getting around that is the Mexican government would like the increased finances from increased trade or something like that. A lot of times when it comes to warrants, you want either two things. You either want a statistic, like this X poll says that X American part of the population believes that immigration reform should pass, right? That is a statistic that you can say, we have the numbers, we have the majority of the population. Another thing that Christy was saying before she left is it's great that you can give your opinion, but at the end of the day, the cross-ex question of, so this is the opinion of a high school student. Do you have a PhD? Do you have a master's in this? How long have you been doing research on that? Comes into play and legitimizes the weight of your argument. So citing experts in the field is another way of supporting your claims, right? Which one is more useful in terms of judging whether or not immigration is going to pass? My mom says that there are more immigrants on our streets, and immigration reform must pass. Or Senator Harry Reid said that they now have 60 votes required to get the immigration bill through the Senate.
Unless your mom is Vice President Joe Biden, I don't.
She wishes. She's a big Biden fan, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, it's good to get evidence from people that are in the field, as opposed to just have an opinion. It might be right, but it's not grounded in being on the ground, being in Congress to deal with that. So, moving on to the components of an argument, a big part of warrants is evidence. So there are 4 criteria for evidence. Because we do debate, it's really 3. But you need to have your evidence needs to be relevant to it. So, for instance, in the immigration file, I put about 5 or 6 pieces of evidence from the past week that's from Politico, from The Hill, from the Washington Post, that says that immigration reform is going to pass. Now, would it have been useful for me to put an article from the New York Times in December of last year that says immigration is going to pass? Why wouldn't that have been useful to put in that file?
7 months old.
Lots changed, right? Or let's go even farther. Why would it have been useful to put it from last summer?
Because immigration itself has changed a lot since last summer, and the opposing team are acting like post-state unions.
Yeah. We had an election, right? So that changed the demographics of the House, and it changed the Senate, and nobody seriously was considering immigration and the specifics of the bill because Congress can barely get things done now. They can barely look a week ahead and get things through. I mean, we've been talking about immigration for 6 months now, think it's better to have the recent articles, the relevant articles, as opposed to something that's later because of like what Devin was saying, post-dating. Post-dating matters in mostly uniqueness debates or relevance debates or the significance because, and this comes in with public forum and Lincoln Douglas in terms of the timeliness of the issue, right? When you're doing your research, you want to have the most recent research of what's actually happening. So say you get a topic about the Middle East, right? And everybody's aware with the upheavals that happened in 2010, 2011, Egypt, Yemen. Is everybody kind of familiar with that? Saw it in the news. It wouldn't be very useful to talk about how stable Egypt is from a piece of evidence in 2006, right? Because you'll just look silly in the cross-examination and when your opponent's like, "That's great, but isn't President Mubarak gone in jail or something? Didn't like all these riots happen in Egypt?" And you don't have the proper facts to refute them or to explain the relevance of that. And that's a very important thing to understand in terms of policy debate as well, is the most recent evidence is what wins and loses you debates. Now, the second part is a part that is relevant for evaluating evidence in like in the classroom setting, not so much in terms of debates, since you are taking a side. You want your evidence to be representative of a particular subject and represent a full range of that. A lot of times, articles or your teacher will be like, you need to have both sides of an issue. Obviously, we're in debate, so you just want that one side. Or when reading something that takes into account both sides, that might hurt you because the part that you underline and read may not be as useful or as good as the part that you're not underlining. It's like reading a piece of evidence on immigration where the first 2 paragraphs are like so-so, saying like there's a pretty good chance immigration reform is going to pass, and then the last 2 paragraphs where you see this a lot, however, but there's no chance of this actually passing because Republicans in the end aren't going to want to give Democrats such large of a win. Does that make sense? So, and then the last 2 are sufficiency and accuracy. There's nothing worse than having data that's false or that's from a place where they're just known for errors, right? This is why some of the no-nos in terms of getting research, by and large, are like Tumblr. I don't know if you can do Pinterest, but I don't really get Pinterest. Maybe Pinterest, Twitter. You know, these are from people that they only have so many viewers, and they don't peer review. They don't have other people reviewing their evidence, which means that a lot of times there can be fallacies in their claims. So the last part of this lecture, we're going to talk about just a bunch of fallacies, right? How many times have you gone to a cross-ex and your opponent has just read something that you had no idea that existed before that speech, had gone? And you can raise your hands higher. It's okay. I've 40% of every debate, because a lot of times when you're negative in these debates, the affirmative gets to pick their side. So obviously they're going to pick some intricacy that helps them. And it's like you only debate a particular affirmative case, 4 or 5 times, whereas this affirmative team has been just reading these arguments again and again for the entire year.
I had a question about the difference between how you word a claim and a warrant. So, like, I understand that a warrant is like a statistic or some evidence, but I don't see how it's differently worded than a claim. Like, if you said 44% of Americans want immigration reform to pass, how is that different from saying Americans want immigration reform to pass?
So your claim would be like immigration reform is passing now,
Okay.
Your data would be like New York Times, 624. Your warrant would be it's going to pass now because of the importance that the Latino voters have in the 2012 election.
So the claim is supported by the warrant is supported by the data.
Yes. You get your warrant from the data, which supports the claim.
Thank you.
So, we're moving, does anybody have any other questions about the basic components of arguments? I mean, once you get this down, it's very, very easy to understand argumentation. Okay, so now we're gonna get into a couple fallacies. The first one is begging the question. This is when you are trying to highlight something where there isn't directly a causal link, or it begs the question of the self-evidence of something. So the example that I found was the unfair and short-sighted legislation that limits free trade is clearly a threat to the American economy. So what is that begging the question to?
Which
It's talking about there isn't really a causal link between free trade and the American economy, right? It is talking about free trade in terms of the American economy. It doesn't provide much of a warrant in terms of how free trade affects the American economy. It's begging the question of what, in terms of the American economy, is threatened by free trade. Does that make sense? For this to be a better argument, it needs to provide that internal link between free trade and the American economy, right? Because there is no part of this sentence that talks about the American economy. Devin?
Another fallacy in the sentence would be the fact that they talk about the unfair and short-sighted legislation.
Yeah, because it doesn't provide, it doesn't talk about how that legislation is in relation to free trade in the American economy. But the big take-home message from this is you need to provide a reason why free trade is a threat to the economy. Clearly is not sufficient in terms of this. So the next fallacy is a false analogy. So how many times do people do this where they have an idea in their head and they try to tack it on to some issue that's relevant or that's being debated in like a classroom where you're saying, like, this is a real world thing that happened to me and I'm trying to tack it on. It happens more than you would think. So the example here is the overcrowded conditions in some part of our city have forced people together like rats in a cage. Like rats, they will eventually turn on one another, fighting and killing until a balance is restored. What does overcrowded conditions have to? How did overcrowded conditions in a city get to us killing each other like rats? Is there really? What is there any link that you can make between the two that make them comparable? Not really. And this happens a lot, more than you would expect in debates and in the real world a lot. So the next analogy is personal attack. We did this in the do's and don'ts earlier today. How many times have this happened to you in a debate where they say, clearly you don't know anything about this topic, or you haven't done any research or something like that? I mean, it's happened to me before, and I was the affirmative, and I thought I knew what I was talking about, but clearly my opponent thought that I was completely insufficient to do that. But personal attacks try to divert attention away from the facts. They try to make you on your guard, because when you're making a personal attack, it makes them think about themselves as opposed to thinking about the actual arguments at hand. Which is, when somebody's doing that to you, you know you have them in a bind because they just don't have anything else going for them because they have to do that. And I mean, the example is pretty clear. With that second sentence, he is a recovering alcoholic, and his second wife just left him. It doesn't really provide a lot of motives or character to the argument about the public should not take Dr. Mason's plan seriously. It doesn't talk about the merits of it. Now, a lot of times, like public debate, a lot of people will believe that to be true, and the whole how many people are familiar with Heidegger? Okay, a fair amount. This is a debate-related one. Is Heidegger was a Nazi? A lot of people love to make that argument, but it doesn't really speak to what policies he had after, or what's another one? Pope Benedict was a Nazi, right? Or who's the new pope? I'm Catholic, I should know this. Pope Francis. You hear about that stuff with Argentina back when there was the revolutions that were happening, and the government was like taking babies and giving them to government families and making him complicit with that. It doesn't really speak to his actual policies that are actually talking about, or the motives, how great of an argument is, and that's why personal attacks should not be used in debates or in arguments in general. So, a couple more fallacies are hasty, sweeping generalizations. I made the cross-ex that I gave. I made a bunch of these. Right? Immigration is great for the economy. It's going to help everybody. We're all going to be friends. Kumbaya. You have a question?
Yeah, what about attacking the source? Like, I used to quote Freakonomics a lot, but I had a lot of people give me flack about that, saying that he's very indecisive and he's not actually an economist.
But that's more of an argument in relation to his qualifications,
Okay.
and not, you never say like, he is an alcoholic, is on his third wife right now,
Right.
He's a wife beater, so, you shouldn't, by and large, you shouldn't have these conversations in debate because they're awkward and unsettling, but it's fine to make qualification challenges, be like, why should we care about a guy that had a PhD in anthropology, referencing whether or not immigration is going to pass, when that is not his field of study. That is attacking his qualifications without saying anthropology is a bankrupt major and they have no idea what they're talking about, and his wife left him. So,
Just a quick question. This actually happens a lot where I'm from, which is Kansas. It actually happens a lot. So what would you suggest would be the best way to answer the personal attacks? For Heidegger, I say stuff like, well, Nazis wear pants. Does that mean Jewish wear pants?
yeah, that's a way of making it silly in terms of that, but that's not relation. Like, a lot of people were under these regimes. That doesn't mean that they agreed with it. Just like if you were held at gunpoint too, or if your life, if it was a matter of life and death, you might do the same thing. And it's also like maybe firing a question back at them, like, can you point to a line of his philosophy that justifies or that coincides with what Nazis were trying to promote, to kind of just put them back on it? But it's more, I don't think this is entirely relevant. And when those issues happen, you should look at the judge, because like Christy, like Jackie was saying, they don't like when you get in fights with your partner. How do you think they like when you get fights with the other team, or where there's something personal attacks? They don't want to judge a debate where you're just calling them a Nazi the entire time. That sounds like the worst debate ever. But, is there another question? So, next is the hasty or sweeping generalizations when it's not based on enough evidence. So, our daughter Maggie really benefited from nursery school. Every child should go. There's not much of a warrant there of why. every child should go, right? I mean, there's people that probably live like 3 or 4 counties away. They probably shouldn't go to that because it would take them forever. One other generalization may be this startup firm made a lot of money because of its immigrants. All immigrants should come into the country, right? It's generalizations where there are exceptions that make it a fallacy. So for instance, there are some immigrants that shouldn't come to this country. Some of them might be from Al Qaeda, right? Probably shouldn't let those people in. They're not the biggest fans of us. That probably make a little bit of sense. I don't think any of you are going to be pro Al Qaeda right here. You can be, but Jackie might come and pounce you with her pro America stuff.
She'll get you.
Do you see that a lot of times when you're making a generalization in debate, it allows for your opponent to tear you apart, right? When you make these generalizations, it allows them to make you look silly in cross-examination. You know, with that same cross-ex question of, so you think every immigrant? You think Osama bin Laden should have been let in this country? He could have done even more damage than the 2 towers. You know, stuff like that allows them to decrease your speaker points because it might not affect the argument at the end, but it decreases the credibility of that argument. Now, another fallacy is an either-or fallacy, where it assumes that only 2 alternatives exist, but there may be others. So the example here is, we must choose between life or death, between intervention and genocide. There can be no neutral position.
This was basically the entire last Lincoln Douglas topic because it was about intervention. So it was all everybody saying, if we don't intervene, there's going to be genocide, and if we do, there's going to be war. So how would you get around a fallacy like that?
Well, there's things that can be done to prevent that, and you could have said that there are ways to better deal with that. So think about Syria that's currently happening right now. How many people have looked at it in the news? You're aware that there's civil war going on in Syria. There's a bunch of rebels that are trying to take over cities. There have been some allegations that Bashar al-Assad has been using chemical weapons on various populations. Is everybody kind of familiar with that? And a lot of people are saying that the U.S. is allowing genocide because they are not sending troops. But an argument that could be made is saying that it's not all Syria or the U.S. in terms of that. There are other factors. There are other people that are related in terms of that. So, you know, we can provide aid, and then other people can help. It's not just between intervention and genocide. There can be limited intervention. There can be some assistance. There's no reason that the U.S. has to intervene in every instance, or there'll be genocide, because it's not like the United States gets involved in every conflict, right? How many people were watching the news when everything that happened in Libya, when we sent a couple of troops? But we didn't send a lot of troops. A lot of it was France, and a lot of there's some UN assistance that was sent, but it wasn't an Iraq or Afghanistan intervention, right? There is that kind of fine line in between that. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any other questions? So the next is a red herring, and it's when the focus of an argument is changed to divert the audience from the actual issue. So going back to the cross-ex between Todd and I mean, his question was, what's the importance of immigrants? Why is immigration good? And then I somehow changed the conversation to, I got a MacBook, You got a MacBook. Don't we love our MacBooks? You got an iPhone? I wish I had an iPhone. And it allows people to divert attention, but it diverts away from the actual arguments that matter. So, for instance, in this example, it is the mayor has proposed building a new baseball-only sports stadium. How can he even consider allocating millions to this irresponsible scheme when so many professional players have drug problems? There's clearly a divide from the actual issue at hand and then the new baseball stadium. He's trying to show this nice new shiny object that will provide probably some other benefits such as bringing jobs and other things, when the actual pressing issue is these baseball players and their drug issues in relation to steroids. So whenever that happens, these are things that a lot of times people's evidence points out, because it's very hard to research things where you want your claim, your warrant to match up entirely, because a lot of times that article will have the but or the however, and it's your job to read that evidence and then point out those red herrings. Now, the next one is appealing to doubtful authority. And it's citing people who may have name recognition but no authority on an issue. So, in terms of the immigration debate, who comes to mind? Who comes to mind? Like, think about when you watch like CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News. Who are those people that usually are brought on to talk about immigration? I actually don't. George Lopez, maybe? Stephen Colbert, did you say?
No, Joe Arpaio.
Okay, Joe Arpaio.
Is Stephen Colbert on?
On Fox News.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Rubio actually has some authority in terms of it,
Oh, you mean without it?
without authority. So a lot of times they'll bring on people that have an opinion, but do not have any actual authority in terms of it. So it's important to look at this evidence, because when you're researching an issue, there are only the best evidence is the evidence where they have authority on the issue at hand. So think in terms of immigration, right? Which is more useful? A byline about George Lopez wanting half of his family to come into the United States, so he thinks immigration reform is going to pass, or Ricky Rubio, who is a senator that has been corralling votes in the Senate for immigration for the past couple of months. Rubio? Right. So these are ways that you can look at people's evidence, because a lot of times it's easier for reporters to get a line or two from somebody from a super PAC or somebody from a labor group that says that these issues are going to pass or these issues are important, but they actually don't have any authority to get those things through. So those are useful arguments that you can make in the debate. Their evidence has no warrant, or their warrant is poor because it's not speaking from a level of authority. There is doubtful authority. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, we got to this a little bit before, misleading statistics. So it can be a misrepresentation or a distortion of facts. Women will never be competent firefighters. After all, 50% of the women in the city's training program failed the exam. Do we agree with that they can never be competent firefighters? I mean, that seems like a pretty damning statistic, that 50% of the women in the city's training program failed that. Is that right?
Well, it says women will never be competent firefighters, but only 50% don't pass.
Yeah, and in a given city, women are 50% of the population, give or take. It's not like all women took the city's training program. Maybe 10 took the training program and half of them failed. It's a fallacy that there will never be competent firefighters because it's insufficient data. Any questions?
Yeah, I feel what if some, maybe it wasn't exaggerated like this, but what if it was like just a small BS and like no one would know?
No one would know?
I mean you would know, but like, it's not a cracked fact, but you're only BSing so you can win.
It happens a lot, it happens, and you just need to be prepared, like, I'll say right now, do not do that, but sometimes your evidence doesn't support it enough, and you end up having to do that. You just need to be aware that there are parts of your argument that's not gonna be the strongest, so you need to be willing to discard that evidence. This happens a lot because you're only given so many minutes in cross-examination, so it's kind of pursue at your own risk is kind of the way that you should go. Be prepared to be able to concede that that data is insufficient or lose on that argument. I'll try to put out as many winning arguments as possible, and if you get away with that because your opponent just did not capitalize on that error in your affirmative case or negative case, good for you, but it's not by and large a winnable strategy. Does that make sense? So, one example of a distortion of statistics would be in this past election, having a piece of evidence, say it's like mid-October, and having a piece of evidence that says that Romney, from like April, that says that Romney is ahead by like 5 or 6 points, right? That evidence distorts the actual what would be currently happening, and would be very easy for the other team to be like, listen, your evidence about Romney being ahead is 6 months old and does not properly describe the status quo. Does that make sense? Okay. Alright, so that's all I have. Are there any questions?
Can you show us how to get on the Google thing?
The Google group?